Hey guys, this is Smithy. Welcome to my channel. Today is yet another very special video. We're going to dupe the newest Odens eye palette, which is the Solmane 2 eyeshadow palette. This is going to be launching on 20th of May 2022 and it will be retailed at $32.90. So about $33 I would say. Now, I personally think that this is a beautiful color story. It has 3 rows of 5 shades each. So it's a 15 shade eyeshadow palette, which is 8 mattes and 7 shimmers. And I personally feel if you did miss out on these legendary Diversa collection, all 3 of these, because it was like a very limited edition palettes, this palette comprises of everything together is what I personally feel. So if we look at the palette, it is beautifully divided among 3 rows. So it has a row of like blues and then purples and then yellowy orange shades, which I personally, when I saw those color scheme, it totally did remind me of these palettes as well as the Age of Opulence palette from Beauty Bay. So that's what I'm going to dupe it with. I have a few shades here and there from other palettes also. So I'm basically going to dupe these shades. I'm not going to say dupe, but find similar shades. If you do have these palettes in your collection, let me help you to figure out whether you actually do need this Solmane 2 eyeshadow palette or if you already do have these repetitive shades already in your collection. So without further ado, let's dive right into the video. After we dupe all these shades and I show those shades to you, we're going to create like 2 different eye looks using these dupe shades. So yeah, let's begin. So let's move on to the first row. The first shade in the palette is called Soft Cloud. And this is a pastel blue shade, which is being duped by this shade from the Hummingbird palette. And the shade name is called Clear Blue. So let me swatch this out. Again, this palette does have like 2 pastel shades, out of which this is the first one. And that is a very light pastel shade, I would say. I have my son here in this room, like playing with his toys. So if you hear some background noises, that's what it is. He's in that age group. He's 3 years old. So yeah, I cannot contain him. Especially on top of my tan skin tone, it's going to look like a white blue shade. But it's a very, very pastel light blue shade. The second shade in the palette is called Mercury. And this is being duped by the shade called Tropics, again from the Hummingbird palette. It's a shimmery mint shade, I would say. So let me swatch it for you guys. So that's like one swipe situation. Again, these legendary Diversa collection palettes did have like multi-chromes in it, but this palette specifically is like attained towards mattes and shimmers. And that's why even though it has like 15 shades in the palette, it's rated very similar to these legendary Diversa collection palettes because multi-chrome shades do tend to be a lot more expensive than the regular shimmer shades. So I think that is why the price is like pretty similar, even though they have more shades. The third shade in the first row is called Neptune, and this is being duped. It's a mid-tone blue matte shade. We do have a mid-tone matte blue shade here in the Giant Wolves palette, which is called Azure. This is Azure, and that is duping the shade called Neptune from the Solmane 2 eyeshadow palette. Okay, now let's move on to another shade. Oh my God, I would have dropped this. And I would have not been happy for sure. Okay, now I feel like a lot of blues and purples can be found from the Age of Opulence palette also, which perfectly dupes the next shade, which is called Deep Space from the palette. And this is being duped by the shade called Revival from the Age of Opulence palette. This one, I know this palette is also out of stock. It's not available anymore. But if you do have it, I mean, if you do have this mid-tone blue shimmer shade, I think you're in a very good spot with that because it's exactly like this. So let me swatch it for you. Again, this is the shade Revival from the Age of Opulence palette, which dupes the shade called Deep Space from the Solmane 2 palette. Now, the last shade in the first row is called Nebula, and this is a deep indigo shade in a matte finish, and this is being duped by this shade, which is called Lavish from the Age of Opulence palette. This indigo shade, such a beautiful shade. I mean, I love this shade. I'm not a lot into blues. When I'm like interested into going into blue shades, I think this is such a beautiful shade. Now you can see like this is the first row, and you can definitely create like a very monochromatic blue eyeshadow look by using these shades. Beautiful, like stunning. Love, love, love it. Okay, now let me just swipe all these things together and let's move on to the second row. I'm going to give you a close-up of all the shades together so that you can see all the shades together in all its glory. But now, just to show you in a close-up situation, I'm just going to show you row by row. So in the second row, the first shade is called Meteor, and this is a lavender, a very light lavender shimmer shade. Now if you do have the Giant Wolves palette, the shade Hearty is very close to it. And also if you do not have that palette, and if you do have the Michaela palette, it does have the shade which is called Manifest. This one, the lavender shimmer shade, that is also very close to that shade. So I'm going to actually swatch Hearty, and let me swatch it. Yeah, let's swatch it here. It's such a beautiful shade. Look at that shade. Like, it's such beautiful dimension. Like, this is right up my alley. You know I love my purples and my mauves and those lavender tone shades. So this is like definitely going on my eyes. Love it. Now the second shade in that row is called Dream, and this is a light purple, a pastel purple lavender shade, I would say. So this actually, I did dupe it with the Tiny Marvels palette because I know that there's a shade very similar to that, and this is called Jewel Bee. Again, a pastel purple shade. But let's say if you do not have this palette, Michaela palette also does have a similar shade, but it's not that pastel-y. Can you see this shade? It's called MJ. But I personally feel that the Jewel Bee shade would be much similar to that. So I'm going to swatch this shade. Sorry, I didn't even show it to you. So that is the pastel lavender shade. Again, Jewel Bee from the Tiny Marvels palette, which dupes the shade called Dream from the Solmane 2 eyeshadow palette. Now let's move on to the next eyeshadow, and the next eyeshadow is called Starry Sky, and this is a pinky golden shimmery shade. And I personally, when I saw that shade, there were two shades that came into my mind. First was Crush from the Age of Opulence palette, and this is also a very light pale pink with a golden shift shade. So I'm going to swatch that. But also if you do have that Michaela palette, sorry, did I move you guys? I think I did. Also, if you do have that Michaela palette, there's a very similar shade in that palette also. I'll show it to you. But let me first swatch this. Again, you can see it's a very light pastel, light pink shade, but also it has like a golden shift to it. So I thought that this shade is very close to that. Again, this shade is called Crush from the Age of Opulence palette. Also, if you do have the Michaela palette, the shade which is called Glow Up would be very similar to that. Again, this is also with a pink with like a golden shift to it. Love it. Now let's move on to a deeper shade in the palette. I love that all the three rows have like one deeper shade each, and I personally feel that is the way to do a palette. If you are like making a palette, you should give like a light and a mid-tone and a deeper range to it. That's how I love my palettes. So I was very happy to see this shade in the palette. Now, the next shade in the palette is called Galaxy, which is being duped by the shade called Dandy from the Age of Opulence palette. Now this is, you can see it's like a plummy purple matte shade. I absolutely love this shade, absolutely. But let's say if you do not have the Age of Opulence palette, and if you do have the Legendary Diversa palettes in your collection, this is the shade. I'll show it to you in a minute. Look at that shade. I love that it goes that deep. I really love that. Now, let's say if you do not have that Age of Opulence palette and you cannot find it, but you did have the Giant Wolves palette from the Oden's Eye. I think if you mix the shade Ablaze and Howling together, you can get a very similar, like that plummy purple shade. So I definitely wanted to give you that option also. Now, let's move on to the last shade of that row, and it's called Hallucinations. And this is also duped from the Age of Opulence palette, and the shade is called Age. This mid-tone purple shimmer shade, very similar to that. Again, if you do not have that, Michaela palette also has a very similar shade, and it is called Immaculate from the Glam Light Michaela palette. Also, if you have the Hummingbird palette, where's my palette? Also, if you have the Hummingbird palette, the shade which is called Hummingbird also is a purple shimmer shade, but I would say this is the deepest. But I personally feel the shade Immaculate would be the most closest shade to that shade. Let me swatch that. And this is the second row swatched for you guys. Look how beautiful this row is. So up my alley. Like, am I right or am I right? Like, I love this. Okay, now let me just wipe all these swatches and let's move on to the third and the final row of that eyeshadow palette. Okay, now let's move on to the last row. The first shade in the last row is called Warm Light, and this has been duped by the shade which is called Chanterelle from the At Forest Side palette. I personally feel that this is like the most perfect shade dupe for that palette. It is a very yellowy orange matte shade, and I don't think anything else in my collection goes closer than this. So I definitely wanted to swatch this. So pretty, love it. Again, this is the shade Chanterelle from the At Forest Side Colourpop palette, which dupes the shade called Warm Light from the Solmane 2 eyeshadow palette. Now let's move on to the next shade, and this is called Sunlight, and this I would say is a warm bronzy shade, and this has been duped by the Michaela palette, and the shade is called What's Poppin', which is this shade in the palette. It's a warm tone bronze shade, and I personally feel that it really complements that shade. Even if you do not have that palette, even the At Forest Side palette does have a very yellowy gold shade. I personally feel that that What's Popping shade is much closer to that. So I'm going to swatch that. So pretty. So that is the shade called What's Poppin' from the Glam Light Michaela palette, which dupes the shade called Sunlight from the Solmane 2 eyeshadow palette. Now let's move on to the next shade. And the next shade in the palette is called Solar. And this again is duped by the Michaela palette, and the shade is called Buffalo Chicken. This beautiful orange punchy shade. And that, I mean, is such an exact dupe to that shade. So I'm just gonna swatch this. I don't even want to give you any other option to you guys. That's how similar this shade is. Again, this is the shade called Buffalo Chicken from the Glam Light Michaela palette, which dupes the shade called Solar from the Solmane 2 eyeshadow palette. 2 more shades to go, guys, and which both of them are duped by the Odens Legendary Diversa Collection palettes. So let me close everything else. Okay, so the next shade in the palette is called Eternal, which I would say is more of a reddy bronze shade, and this is being duped by the shade called Amber from the Red Dragon palette. I personally feel that this is very close. It might not be like an exact dupe because this is more of like a copper bronze shade, and the other one is a little more on the redder side, I would say. But nevertheless, I think this is very, very close, especially when you put it on your eyes. I mean, yeah, you won't be able to find the difference. Again, this is Amber from the Odens Eye Red Dragon palette, which dupes the shade called Eternal from the Solmane 2 eyeshadow palette. And the last shade in the palette is called Black Hole, which is a matte black shade, and this is being duped by the shade called Annihilation from the Giant Wolves palette. Again, any matte black shade would do, but this is such a beautiful matte black shade that I'll definitely want to swatch this. How beautiful is that? So that is how the third row will look. Beautiful warm tones. Love it. Love, love, love it. I don't know why am I craving these tones. Oh my god, I am really, really craving that. So let's make an eye look. Let's do an eye look all together. But before that, let me give you a close-up of all how the shades look all together. And you can decide for yourself whether you do have these shades already in your collection. Do you actually need that eyeshadow palette or not? You can make the decision for yourself. I definitely would not tell you whether you need to buy it or you do not need to buy it. I personally, I'm making a very conscious decision of not getting repeated shadows in my collection. That is why I dupe these eyeshadow palettes, not because I do not love them. You clearly can see I'm a big Odens Eye fan. And I am very sure that this eyeshadow palette is also going to be absolutely lovely. But because I do have those shades in my collection, I'm going to skip this for sure. Okay, let's begin the eye looks. I'm first going to take the shade called Chanterelle from the At Forest Side palette. It's been quite some time that I've not used this palette, so I'm excited to dive into this. I'm gonna put that in my inner third of the eye look. I'm just gonna make this as my transitioning shade, especially in the inner third. Love this warm tone shade. Absolutely love it. Yeah, to complement this eye look on the outer corners, I'm gonna take this shade, which is called Dandy from the Age of Opulence palette. I personally feel that that would go so well together. First, I'm gonna stamp it, and then I'll lightly blend that shade. Look how deep it is. I'm gonna lightly melt it together with that yellow, and when that yellow and purple will mix together, it'll give more of a pinky transitioning shade. I'll be giving a very light pressure on it, but yeah, that's how it's gonna translate. It's gonna be like a yellow to a pink to a purple. Beautiful. I'm gonna take the same shade Dandy on my lower lash line just to melt everything together. And now, what are we gonna do for the eyes? That's a good question. First, I'm gonna put some glitter glue on my eyes, just because I don't want any shimmers. So moving around my eyelid. So I'm gonna very lightly, very messily, just put that NYX glitter glue all across. Not going for any shape or anything, I just want a scattered shimmer look. And this glitter glue would help to adhere all the shimmers in the right direction. That's exactly what we want. So now I'm going to take this shade, which is called Amber from the Red Dragon palette. I'm going to take it with my fingers because I want it to be like messy. And I'm going to just place that on the center of my eyelid and then melting it towards that plummy purple shade. And if we want, we can intensify that purple a tiny little bit more after we apply the shade. You can see how beautiful the dimension is. I love these eyeshadows. So pretty. Now for the inner third of my eyelid, I'm going to take this shade, which is called Glow Up. Yeah, Glow Up from the Michaela palette, because I feel like that would go really good together. I'm loving that amber shade more, so I'm just going to tap it right where it meets with that shade Glow Up, like very messily. But I think that is a good gradient. I love the way how it's all turned out. I'm going to finish off my eyes with some liner and mascara and I'll get right back. Love the way how this eye turned out. So this is my first eye look. Love the addition of that yellow mustardy shade into that purple plum shade. Love it. Okay, now let's move on to the other eye look. Let's take the shade called Buffalo Chicken from the Michaela palette, this bright orange shade, and let's see what we can get into, because yeah, in the mood to try out some colors on the eyes, then yeah, it's very less that I experiment with colors, and I feel like this is a perfect occasion to dive into colors. Love that orange. And now that orange, I want to transition it to a pastel purple shade. So I'm going to dip into the Tiny Marvels palette and take that Jewel Bee shade, which is the pastel purple shade, and I'm going to go over that on the outer corners, because I feel like I want to play with some blues on the outer corners here. So this would be a great transition shade for that blue. Yes, now to deepen up the outer corner, I want to take the shade called Lavish. I'm going to take that same outer corner brush that I used on this eye. I just flipped the brush so that I don't get purple. And I'm going to concentrate the blue here on the outer corner and go more on like a diagonal manner. Just stamping the product, not trying to blend anything right now. I'm getting a lot of fallout from this eyeshadow, which is gonna be a problem, I guess. re-questioning my creative aspect. I think I'll just have to wipe off my under eyes, and then I'll just put the concealer once I'm done with the eyelid. Okay, so now once we have that, let's go with the shade which is called Manifest, this one, on the lid. And before that, I'm gonna put some glitter glue on my eyelid because I don't want any more fallout. Again, messily apply that. I'm also tapping it on the bridge where it connects to that deep indigo shade, just so that I have something to stick onto it. Now I'm going to take the shade called Manifest from the palette, and I'm going to tap that right here in the inner third of my eyelid. Oh, look at that shade. Stunning. And then I'm going to also take the shade called Immaculate from the palette. This one, the purpley shade. And then I'm going to just bridge that shade right in the center of Immaculate and that navy blue shade. Just like that. Whatever is left on my eyes, I'm going to take that on my lower lash line too from Immaculate. Just like that. And just to blend the edges of that shade, of that blue shade, I'm going to take the shade which is called Azure. Yeah, Azure, a very tiny little bit. And I'm just going to blend the edges. And again, I'm going to dip into that buffalo chicken shade, the orange shade, and just intensify the inner third again, because I think I've lost that orange in the midst of creating this eye look. Loving the way it came out. So now I'm just going to finish off my eyes. I'll just put a little bit of concealer underneath my eyes and put some liner and mascara, and I'll get right back. And for the inner corners, I'm just going to take the same glow up shade from the Michaela palette and also apply here, same as the other eye. And that is it, guys. So that is my second eye look. I'm just closing my first eye look so that you don't get like distracted. I tend to get distracted myself, so yeah. I love the purpley bluey tones in the eyes, and this is like super warm and like orangey and mustardy and purple. Love it. Love both the eye looks. So let me give you a close-up of both the eye looks. I really hope that you guys enjoyed these two eye looks that I created by duping the Solmane 2 eyeshadow palette from Oden's Eye. And let me know in the comment section below, out of these two eye looks, which is your favorite eye look? And are you interested? Are you excited about this launch or not? By the way, this whole collection comes out with like blushes and highlighters and eye pencils also. I was majorly interested in the eyeshadow palette. That's why I duped that. I think that would be okay for you, but I'll link everything in the description box below for you guys. I have a lot of friends here on YouTube who have already like reviewed this eyeshadow palette because they had been gifted the eyeshadow palette from Oden's Eye. So I'll link actually Millie's video in the description box below for you guys if you want to check out the actual review of the palette. But yes, if you did like this dupes video, do give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and ring the notification bell so that you're notified every time that I post next. I generally upload 3 videos every single week, every Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays at 9 AM Eastern Standard Time. Until next time, I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye guys!